The corporate world doesn't bleed red. It bleeds ink and non-disclosure agreements. Archer learned that scraping dried mud off the mahogany floors of the 71st floor. They called Camille Montgomery the Iron Queen of Wall Street. Untouchable. Until 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, when her board locked her in a glass room, her high-priced lawyer walked out, and she was left to the wolves. Archer just had a mop bucket and a bad back. But sometimes, that's all it takes to shatter the glass. The smell was always the first thing that hit him. A suffocating blend of industrial lemon-scented floor cleaner, stale espresso, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone leaking from the heavy-duty copy machines. Archer pushed the yellow bucket forward. The front left caster wheel was warped, dragging against the polished concrete with a high-pitched, rhythmic squeal that vibrated straight up the plastic handle and into his aching knuckles. Squeak, slosh, squeak, slosh. It was 1:15 a.m. The 71st floor of Montgomery Holdings was a mausoleum of glass, steel, and ruthless ambition, suspended high above the sprawling, amber-lit grid of the city. During the day, this floor buzzed with a specific kind of low-frequency anxiety. People in $3,000 suits speaking in hushed, hurried tones. But at night, it was just Archer, the hum of the climate control, and the ghosts of $1 billion moving across digital ledgers. He plunged the mop into the soapy water, the cotton strings heavy and grey. He wrung it out with the rusted lever, the dirty water cascading back into the reservoir with a hollow splash. Archer was 52, though the deep trenches around his mouth and the permanent stoop of his shoulders made him look a decade older. His uniform was stiff polyester, navy blue, with A. Pendleton stitched over the breast pocket in a thread that was unraveling at the N. He didn't mind the uniform. In fact, he relied on it. It was an invisibility cloak. In a building where net worth equated to human value, a man in polyester pushing a mop was a ghost. They looked right through him. They stepped over his wet floor signs. They had conversations about hostile takeovers, layoffs, and offshore tax havens while he emptied the very trash cans they were leaning against. He liked being a ghost. Ghosts didn't get fired. Ghosts didn't have to explain why they couldn't afford the rent hike on their cramped 2-bedroom apartment. Ghosts just did the work, collected the bi-weekly direct deposit, and went home to make sure their daughter's insulin was stocked. Maya, Archer paused, leaning his weight against the mop handle. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the grit of dried sweat against his skin. Maya had a biology test tomorrow. She'd been asleep at the kitchen table when he left for his shift, her cheek pressed against an open textbook. He gently slipped a coaster under her drooling mouth and draped a blanket over her. She was 14, brilliant, and entirely too fragile for the world Archer could afford to provide her. The medical bills from her diagnosis 3 years ago had eaten his savings. The subsequent divorce had taken the house. Now there was just the mop, the squeaky wheel, the lemon scent. He dragged the mop across the floor outside Conference Room A, the boardroom. It was a massive, intimidating space encased in thick, sound-dampening acoustic glass. Inside, a single pendant light illuminated a table made of reclaimed redwood, so heavily polished it looked like dark water. Usually the room was dark by 9 p.m. Tonight it wasn't. Through the glass, Archer saw figures moving. 4 of them. He didn't stop mopping. Rule number 1 of being a ghost: never linger. But his eyes flicked upward, catching the tableau inside the room. He recognized Camille Montgomery instantly. Everyone did. She was the CEO, the founder, the architect of this empire. She was usually a blur of aggressive momentum, sharp tailoring, severe blonde hair pulled back tightly, eyes that could strip the paint off a wall. She didn't walk, she marched. Archer had only spoken to her once in 3 years. He had dropped a bottle of ammonia. She had stepped over it, said, "Careful," without breaking stride, and vanished into an elevator. Tonight, she wasn't marching. She was seated at the far end of the redwood table, completely still. Her posture was rigidly straight, but there was a brittleness to it, like a dry twig under a boot. Standing across from her were 2 men and a woman. Archer knew them by their trash. There was Preston, a broad-shouldered executive vice president whose wastebasket was always full of crumpled receipts from high-end steakhouses and half-empty blister packs of antacids. There was Gable, younger, slicker, who threw away copious amounts of shredded documents and empty bottles of expensive cologne. And there was the woman, Davies, who never left anything in her trash at all, which Archer always found far more unsettling. But it was the 5th man in the room that made Archer pause his mop, mid-stroke. Richard Hayes, Montgomery's lead corporate counsel, the fixer. Hayes was a man whose suits looked like liquid armor. Archer watched as Hayes stood near the door, a heavy leather briefcase resting on the table. Archer wasn't a corporate strategist. He was a janitor, but he knew body language. He knew the way predators circled when a larger animal was wounded. The air in that room, visible even through the thick acoustic glass, was toxic. He looked down at his dirty mop water. "Not your business, Artie. Keep moving. Finish the floor, empty the recycling, clock out, go home to Maya." He plunged the mop back into the bucket. Slosh. But as he grabbed the handle to move down the hall, his eyes caught a sudden violent movement inside the boardroom. Camille Montgomery had slammed her hand flat against the redwood table. Archer froze. He took a slow step closer to the glass. The acoustic glass was rated to muffle the roar of Manhattan traffic to a whisper, but it couldn't completely block the sharp, acoustic crack of Camille's palm against the wood. Archer pressed his shoulder against the hallway wall, staying in the shadow cast by a large potted ficus tree. Inside the room, the silence that followed the slap was heavy, suffocating. Camille was looking up at Richard Hayes. Her face, usually an unreadable mask of pale foundation and sharp contouring, was flushed. Her lips were moving rapidly. Even without the sound, Archer could read the desperate, tight cadence of her words. She was cornered. She was demanding answers. Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't yell back. That was the worst part. Archer watched the lawyer slowly, methodically unscrew the cap of his silver Montblanc pen. He laid it neatly in a velvet-lined groove inside his briefcase. It was a gesture of supreme, insulting calm. He was treating the furious billionaire in front of him like a minor inconvenience, like a spilled cup of coffee. Preston, the broad-shouldered VP, leaned over the table. He was smiling. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the tight, lipless grimace of a man who held a winning hand and was waiting for his opponent to bleed out. He slid a thick manila folder across the dark wood. It stopped an inch from Camille's hands. Archer could hear the muffled vibration of voices now, slipping through the crack beneath the heavy glass door. "Core fiduciary duty, Camille," Preston's voice filtered through, sounding like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "The board has voted, unanimously. The optics of the SEC investigation alone will tank the stock by morning. You step down now, sign the proxy transfer, and we frame it as a health leave." Camille laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound that barely made it through the door. "An investigation you orchestrated, Preston. You fabricated the shell company ties. You think I don't know that? Richard, tell them. Tell them we have the paper trail proving Gable authorized those transfers." She looked at her lawyer, her shield, her attack dog. Hayes snapped his briefcase shut. The metallic clack of the brass latches echoed sharply, even in the hallway. "I can't do that, Camille," Hayes said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Because my obligation is to Montgomery Holdings, the entity, not to you personally. And as chief counsel to the entity, I must advise the board that your continued presence as CEO poses an existential threat to the company's valuation." Archer felt his stomach drop. Jesus! He understood what he was watching. It wasn't just a firing. It was an assassination, a meticulously planned, legally binding execution in a locked glass box. Camille stared at Hayes. For the first time, Archer saw the Iron Queen falter. The rigid posture broke just a fraction. Her shoulders slumped forward by a millimeter. Her eyes, wide and suddenly hollow, searched the lawyer's face for a punchline that wasn't coming. You're recusing yourself?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried a profound, slicing betrayal. "After 8 years, you're leaving me in this room with them." "I am advising you," Hayes said, lifting his briefcase off the table, "to sign the documents Mr. Preston has provided. It is the cleanest exit available to you. Good night, Camille." Hayes turned toward the door. Camille stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Richard, you step out that door. I will make sure you never practice law in this city again. I will burn your reputation to ash." It was an empty threat. The desperation in her voice stripped it of any power. They all knew it. Hayes didn't even break his stride. Archer panicked. Hayes was heading for the door. If he stepped out, he would see Archer standing there, eavesdropping. Archer scrambled backward, grabbing the handle of his mop bucket. He shoved it down the hall, the squeaky wheel screaming in the quiet corridor, and ducked into the alcove, housing the men's restroom, just as the heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. He held his breath, leaning against the cold tile of the bathroom wall. He smelled urinal cakes and cheap pine air freshener. He heard Hayes's heavy leather shoes clicking against the mahogany floor. Click, click, click. The sound grew fainter as the lawyer walked toward the private executive elevator. A soft chime sounded. The doors opened and closed. He was gone. Archer exhaled slowly. He peeked his head out from the alcove. The hallway was empty, but the glass door to the boardroom had slowly clicked shut again. Inside, the dynamic had shifted completely. With Hayes gone, the thin veneer of professional courtesy vanished. Preston, Gable, and Davies moved closer to the table. They were looming. Gable, the slick one, had taken his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He tapped the manila folder with his index finger. Camille was standing, but she was leaning heavily on the table, her knuckles white. She looked small. Archer had never realized how short she actually was without the imposing armor of her authority. Surrounded by the 3 board members in the dim light, she looked like a solitary survivor on a shrinking raft. "No one is coming, Camille," Gable said, his muffled voice dripping with condescension. Richard was the last hurdle. He saw the writing on the wall. Now you can either sign the transfer, keep your equity, and disappear to the Hamptons, or we call the feds at 8 a.m., hand over the fabricated ledger that looks incredibly real, and you spend the next 10 years tied up in federal court while we seize the company anyway. "It's extortion," Camille said, her voice shaking now. Not with anger, but with sheer, exhausted panic. "It's illegal." "It's business," Davies said softly, speaking for the first time. "Sign the paper, Camille." Preston moved around the table, encroaching on her physical space. He picked up a heavy silver pen and held it out to her. He was standing too close. He was using his size to intimidate her. Archer's hands tightened around the plastic grip of his mop. The rough texture bit into his calluses. "Walk away," his brain screamed. "You are 52 years old. You have a bad back. You make $14 an hour. You have a sick kid. This is billion-dollar warfare. Walk away." He looked at Camille. She was looking at the pen in Preston's hand. A tear, a single, humiliating, entirely human tear, broke free and tracked through her expensive foundation. She was breaking. The sheer weight of the betrayal, the isolation, the physical intimidation of being trapped in a room at 2 a.m. It was working. She slowly reached her hand out toward the pen. Archer closed his eyes. He thought of Maya. He thought of the eviction notices he used to hide in the microwave so she wouldn't see them. He thought of what it felt like to have a boot on your neck, to be cornered by people who held all the power and knew you had none. It wasn't a rush of heroism that filled Archer's chest. It was a dark, bubbling, exhausted irritation. He was so incredibly tired of people with power treating people without it like garbage. He opened his eyes. He didn't think about his pension. He didn't think about the rent. Archer stepped out of the alcove, gripped the handle of the yellow mop bucket, and pushed it straight toward conference room A. Squeak, slosh, squeak, slosh. The warped caster wheel screamed like a dying banshee in the dead, silent hallway. Inside the boardroom, Preston's head snapped up. Gable stepped back from the table. Camille froze, her trembling fingers hovering an inch from the silver pen. Archer didn't slow down. He marched right up to the heavy acoustic glass door, hit the metal pushbar with his hip, and shoved it wide open. The immediate rush of air conditioning hit him, carrying the scent of expensive wool, cold sweat, and Gable's cloying, citrus-heavy cologne. Archer dragged the wet mop across the threshold, letting the heavy, dirty strings slap loudly against the pristine redwood flooring. "Excuse me," Archer said. His voice was gravelly, unused to speaking above a low mutter. He didn't look at the billionaires. He looked at the floor. "Got a spill out here. Needs buffering. Safety hazard." He plunged the mop into the bucket. He wrung it out. The mechanical grinding of the rusty lever echoed through the boardroom like a chainsaw. Preston stared at him, his face contorting into a mask of pure, aristocratic outrage. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Get out!" Archer didn't make eye contact. He sloshed the damp mop onto the floor near Gable's Italian leather shoes, intentionally leaving a wide, soapy puddle. "Can't do that, sir. Building maintenance protocol. Biohazard on floor 71. Gotta sanitize." "Biohazard," Gable snapped, looking down at his shoes in disgust. "Are you insane? We are in a closed-door meeting. Take your bucket and get the hell out of here before I have you thrown out of the building." Archer leaned on his mop. His lower back gave a familiar, sharp throb. He finally lifted his head and looked directly at them. He didn't look at Camille yet. He looked at Preston. Up close, the executive wasn't a god. He was just a sweaty man with bad paws and a heavy pulse beating nervously in his neck. "Meeting's over," Archer said slowly. The words tasted foreign in his mouth. They were defiant, dangerous. "Building closes to non-essential personnel at 2 a.m. for deep cleaning. It's 2:10. You folks gotta vacate." Preston took a step toward Archer, his broad chest puffed out. The intimidation tactic he had just used on Camille was now aimed at the janitor. "Listen to me, you miserable piece of shit. I am executive vice president of this firm. You will turn around, walk out that door, and forget you ever saw us, or I will personally ensure you never hold a job in this state again." Do you understand me? Archer felt the fear. It was cold and sharp, settling in his gut like a stone. He thought of Myers' insulin. God, what am I doing? But then he looked past Preston. He looked at Camille. She was staring at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the tear streak still drying on her cheek. She looked utterly baffled, but more importantly, her hand had pulled away from the pen. The spell of isolation was broken. The locked box had been breached. Archer's grip tightened on the wooden handle of his mop until his knuckles turned bone white. The fear in his gut curdled into stubborn, blue-collar resentment. "I empty your trash, Mr. Preston," Archer said. His voice dropped an octave, losing the deferential customer service tone. It became flat, hard. Preston stopped. "What?" Archer shifted his gaze to Gable. "And yours, Mr. Gable. Every night." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the slick, younger man. "The shredder in your office, room 714. It jams a lot, especially when you try to force 10 pages of offshore routing numbers through it at once. I spent 20 minutes pulling unshredded strips of Cayman Island wire transfers out of the teeth of that machine at midnight." Gable's face went completely, instantly pale. The blood simply vanished from his cheeks. Archer didn't actually know what those numbers meant. He couldn't read a financial ledger to save his life. But he had eyes. He had seen the letterhead. He had seen the panic in the way the paper was jammed. It was a bluff, a massive, uneducated bluff, but he delivered it with the deadpan certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. He turned his attention back to Preston. "I'm not a smart guy, sir. I clean toilets. But I know what extortion looks like. You got her cornered in here. You got a pen. You're telling her to sign, or you'll call the cops." Archer took a step forward, bringing himself directly between Preston and Camille. He smelled the sourness of Preston's sweat beneath his expensive suit. "So," Archer continued, his voice steady despite the rapid hammering of his heart against his ribs. "Here's the new protocol. You're not making her sign anything tonight, because if you do, I'm a witness. And if you call the cops tomorrow, I'll go to the SEC myself, and I'll hand them the trash bags from your offices. All of them. The ones I haven't thrown down the chute yet." Silence descended on the room. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of coercion anymore. It was the frantic, panicked silence of a derailed train. Davies, the quiet woman, finally spoke. Her voice was strained. "He's bluffing. He's a janitor." "Maybe," Archer agreed, shrugging his aching shoulders. "You want to bet $1 billion on it, lady?" Preston's fists were clenched at his sides. He looked from Archer to Camille, then back to Archer. The sheer absurdity of the situation, a multinational hostile takeover being halted by a 52-year-old man in a cheap polyester uniform, was paralyzing them. They were equipped to fight lawyers, injunctions, and board votes. They had no defensive strategy against a man with a mop bucket who didn't care about their titles. "You're making a mistake," Preston hissed, though the gravel in his voice had lost its edge. It sounded defensive now. "You don't know what you're getting involved in." "I know it's past my shift," Archer said bluntly. He turned around, putting his back to the 3 board members, a deliberate sign of disrespect, and looked down at Camille Montgomery. She was still sitting in the chair. Her breathing was uneven. She looked up at him, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning his lined face, his cheap uniform, the frayed stitching of his name tag. She was searching for his motive, his angle. She didn't find one. She only found a tired man with a bad back who had decided he'd had enough bullshit for one night. Archer extended a rough, calloused hand toward her. It smelled faintly of bleach and honest labor. "Ms. Montgomery," Archer said quietly, ensuring only she could hear the slight tremor in his voice. "I think you need to leave this room now, and I will defend you on the way out, because my mop's real dirty, and I don't mind swinging it." Camille stared at his outstretched hand. For a second, the Iron Queen hesitated. She had built her life on never needing help. She had built an empire on trusting no one. Then slowly, she reached out. Her smooth, manicured fingers grasped Archer's rough, scarred palm. "Thank you, Mr. Pendleton," she whispered. Archer pulled her to her feet. The heavy acoustic door of Conference Room A clicked shut behind them. The sound was horribly final, like the heavy latch of a bank vault sealing shut. Archer let go of Camille's hand immediately. His palm was slick with nervous sweat, and a sudden, violent tremor had taken up residence in his left knee. The adrenaline that had propelled him into the lion's den was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow nausea. He had just threatened 3 billionaires and a corporate lawyer. He had just burned his life to the ground. Maya's insulin, a quiet, panicked voice in his head, whispered, "The rent, the electric bill. You stupid, stupid old man. Walk," Archer grunted, his voice tighter than before. He didn't look at her. He didn't grab his mop bucket. He just turned and moved toward the executive elevator bank, his work boots squeaking faintly against the polished floor he had just cleaned. Camille followed. Her gait was stiff. The rhythmic, sharp clack-clack of her Christian Louboutin heels echoed in the empty corridor, a sound usually associated with terror for the junior analysts on this floor. Now it just sounded frantic, uneven. Archer hit the down button. The brushed steel doors slid open instantly. They stepped inside. The executive elevator was a mirrored box with warm, flattering amber lighting and a floor made of imported dark slate. As the doors whispered shut, Archer finally looked at the reflection in the glass. The contrast was physically jarring. Camille Montgomery, tailored Italian wool skirt suit, diamond studs, a silk blouse that cost more than Archer's car, but with a face pale as chalk and mascara slightly smudged at the corner of her left eye. Archer Pendleton, stooped shoulders, a faded navy uniform smelling of cheap industrial soap, deeply entrenched crow's feet, and knuckles swollen with arthritis. He keyed his brass master key into the hidden slot beneath the control panel. He didn't press the button for the lobby. He pressed the unmarked button below it. B2. "Where are we going?" Camille asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual commanding resonance. It was the voice of someone whose brain was still desperately trying to catch up to their reality. "Not the lobby," Archer said, watching the digital floor indicator tick downward. 70, 65, 58. Preston's an arrogant son of a bitch, but he's not stupid. By the time we hit the ground floor, he'll have called security to intercept you. They'll confiscate your keycard, your corporate phone, and escort you out the front door in front of the lobby cameras. Make it look like a standard termination." Camille stared at the ticking numbers. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. They can't lock me out of the servers. I have a 2-factor authentication tied to my personal—" She stopped. She blinked, the gears in her head grinding against the grit of what had just happened. "Gable oversees IT. He pushed a security patch yesterday morning." "There you go," Archer said quietly. 30, 22, 14. The air pressure shifted in their ears. The sleek, silent hum of the elevator began to vibrate slightly as they bypassed the main lobby and descended into the building's concrete roots. "Why?" Camille asked softly, her eyes flicking toward his reflection in the mirror. She wasn't asking about the IT patch. "You make, what, minimum wage? You don't know me. I've never even spoken to you." Archer rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the coarse hair bristling against his collar. He felt exhausted, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that had nothing to do with the hour. 14 an hour, he corrected her, staring at his boots. "And I didn't do it for you, lady. I did it because I was sick of the way he was looking at you. I know that look. It's the look a landlord gives you when he knows you're $50 short on the first of the month." The elevator jolted to a stop. The amber lights flickered. The doors slid open, and the pristine, temperature-controlled atmosphere of Montgomery Holdings vanished. They were hit instantly by a wall of heavy, humid air smelling of hot boiler iron, damp concrete, and the sharp tang of Freon. "Welcome to Sub-Basement 2. Archer stepped out into the dim, fluorescent-lit corridor. The ceiling here was a chaotic nervous system of exposed PVC pipes, thick electrical conduits, and heavy steel ventilation ducts that hummed with a constant, low-frequency vibration. Camille hesitated at the threshold, her expensive heels resting on the metal track of the elevator door. She looked out into the grime-coated industrial hallway, like it was the surface of Mars. "Come on," Archer said, his voice echoing slightly. "Elevator log registers when the doors are open too long." She stepped out. The doors closed behind her, cutting off the last tie to her empire. Archer led her down a narrow corridor, dodging a stack of broken wooden pallets and a leaking utility sink. He pushed open a heavy, scarred fire door marked "Maintenance, Authorized Personnel Only." Inside was the janitorial break room. It was a bleak, windowless cinder-block bunker. A battered folding table sat in the center, surrounded by 4 mismatched plastic chairs. A rusty cage fan rattled in the corner, pushing stale air around. Against the far wall was a row of dented grey lockers. Archer walked over to locker 42, spun the cheap padlock, and pulled it open. He grabbed a faded, oversized grey hoodie he kept for the winter months. He tossed it onto the table. "Put that on," he said. Camille was staring at a brown water stain on the ceiling. She slowly lowered her gaze to the hoodie. "I don't need a sweater." "You're wearing a bright white silk shirt and a $1,000 blazer," Archer said, walking over to a small, sputtering mini-fridge. "You stick out down here like a diamond in a mud puddle. If one of the night engineers sees you, they'll radio it in." He pulled out a plastic bottle of water, cracked the seal, and set it on the table near her. Camille looked at the water, then at the hoodie. She reached up and unbuttoned her blazer, her fingers trembling so badly she struggled with the final button. She slipped it off, revealing the crisp, tailored silk beneath, and pulled Archer's heavy, bleach-stained hoodie over her head. It swallowed her frame entirely, reaching down past her thighs. She sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs. The rigid posture of the Iron Queen finally collapsed. She brought her knees together, hunched forward, and buried her face in her hands. Archer didn't say anything. He pulled out the chair opposite her, wincing as a sharp spike of pain shot up his lumbar spine, and sat down. He gave her a minute. He knew what it felt like to have the floor fall out from under you. The only difference was Archer was used to the fall. This was Camille's first time hitting the concrete. "They're going to freeze everything," Camille said into her hands, her voice muffled, teetering on the edge of a panic attack. "The board accounts. My personal assets are tied to the holding company through a blind trust Preston helped set up. They orchestrated this perfectly. By 8 a.m., my corporate cards will decline. By noon, the SEC will announce the inquiry into the shell company Gable Fabricated." She dropped her hands. Her eyes were wide, frantic. "I don't have access to my own money. I don't have my lawyers. They took my company." "You got your phone?" Archer asked. She nodded, reaching into the pocket of her discarded blazer. She pulled out a sleek, matte black smartphone. She tapped the screen. "No signal," she muttered, her thumbs swiping desperately. "Lead-lined pipes and 10 feet of concrete above us," Archer said. "But even if you had a bar, you shouldn't use it. If Gable runs IT, he's tracking the GPS. You turn that on, they know exactly where you are." Camille stared at the black rectangle of glass in her hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. She set it on the table and pushed it away. "Okay," she breathed, forcing a shaky breath into her lungs. The panic was still there, buzzing beneath her skin, but the cold, calculating CEO was trying to claw her way back to the surface. "Okay, I need to get to an SEC field office. I need to file a whistleblower report before Preston files his fabricated ledger. I need to beat them to the punch." "Field office doesn't open till 8 a.m., Archer said, glancing at the cheap battery-operated clock on the cinder-block wall. It was 2:45 a.m. "You got 5 hours to kill, and you can't kill it here. Shift changes at 4 a.m. This room will be full of guys looking to clock out." Camille looked down at her feet. She slipped her right foot out of her heel. The back of her ankle was rubbed raw, a blister having burst against the stiff leather. A tiny bead of blood stained her sheer tights. "I can't go to my apartment," she said quietly. "It's a corporate lease. Building security reports to the board. They'll be waiting in the lobby." Archer watched the blood on her heel. He thought about the 3 billionaires upstairs. They had fleets of town cars, private security, and billions of dollars. He and Camille had a squeaky plastic chair and a rusty fan. "I know a way out," Archer said slowly. "Service corridor. Leads to the alley behind the loading docks. No cameras, because the sanitation trucks always back into them and break them." "And then?" Camille asked, looking up at him. The power dynamic had entirely shifted. She wasn't commanding him. She was asking him for direction. Archer rubbed his tired eyes. "Walk away, Artie. You got her out of the room. You did your good deed. Leave her in the alley. Go home to Maya." He looked at Camille. She was shivering, despite the heavy hoodie. She looked small, hunted. "And then," Archer sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of his own foolishness, "we figure out how to keep you hidden until the sun comes up." The walk to the loading docks was a subterranean maze. Archer led the way, his heavy work boots mapping a path he had walked 1,000 times, while Camille trailed behind, carrying her heels in one hand, walking in her stockinged feet on the damp, gritty concrete. The air grew colder as they approached the exterior of the building. The smell of hot iron faded, replaced by the unmistakable scent of wet asphalt and rotting garbage. It was raining outside. Archer held up a hand, stopping her at the corner of a dimly lit corridor. He pressed his back against the cold brick and peered around the edge. 50 feet away was the massive, corrugated steel door of the loading dock. To the right of it was a small, heavy steel pedestrian door. Next to that door was a security podium. Sitting at the podium, bathed in the blue glow of a portable television screen, was Sal. Sal was a 60-year-old retired cop with bad knees and a profound indifference to his job. He was supposed to monitor the freight elevators, but mostly he just watched old reruns of Law and Order and ate pistachios. Archer ducked back. He looked at Camille. She was pale, her breath pluming faintly in the cold air. "Guard," Archer whispered, pointing a thumb over his shoulder. "Sal, good guy, but he's got a radio. If Preston told building security to lock down the exits, Sal's got a picture of your face on his phone right now." "Can we sneak past him?" Camille whispered back, her teeth chattering lightly. Archer shook his head. Pedestrian door has a crash bar. It clanks like a church bell when you hit it. He'll look up. Archer closed his eyes, calculating. He knew Sal's habits. He knew the rhythm of the basement. He looked around the corridor. 10 feet back, there was a heavy metal breaker box set into the wall. "Wait here," Archer murmured. "Don't move until the lights drop." He crept back down the hallway, his footsteps silent. He reached the breaker box, opened the latch, and stared at the rows of heavy black switches. He found the section labeled Dock/Ext Bay 4. Archer took a deep breath, wrapped his calloused fingers around the main switch, and yanked it down. A loud, mechanical clack echoed through the corridor. Instantly, the fluorescent lights over the loading dock violently snapped off. The only illumination left was the faint, sickly yellow glow of the emergency exit sign above the door, and the blue light from Sal's little television. "Hey, what the hell?" Sal's voice echoed in the cavernous space. Archer heard the scrape of a metal stool as Sal stood up, followed by the heavy slap of his boots on the concrete. "Damn it! Breaker tripped again." Sal's footsteps moved away from the door, heading toward the electrical room on the opposite side of the bay. "Now," Archer hissed, waving his hand. Camille didn't hesitate. She darted past him, moving with surprising speed in her bare feet. Archer followed right behind her. They reached the heavy steel door. Archer slammed his hip into the crash bar. Clang! The sound was deafening in the dark. "Hey!" Sal yelled from the shadows across the room. "Who's over there?" Archer shoved the door open, grabbed Camille's elbow, and dragged her out into the night. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off Sal's voice. The shock of the cold was immediate. It was pouring rain, a freezing, driving New York downpour that instantly soaked through Archer's thin uniform shirt and plastered Camille's hair to her face. They were standing in a narrow, filthy alleyway lined with towering green dumpsters that smelled of sour milk and wet cardboard. The city loomed above them, a canyon of black glass and glittering lights. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren wailed, a lonely, desperate sound cutting through the white noise of the Rukun. They jogged to the end of the alley, putting a brick wall between them and the loading dock door. Archer leaned heavily against the wet brick, gasping for air. His chest burned, his bad knee screaming in protest. Camille leaned against the wall next to him. The oversized grey hoodie was rapidly absorbing the rain, turning a dark, heavy slate color. She was shivering violently now, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso. She looked nothing like the billionaire who had terrified Wall Street just 2 hours ago. She looked like a drowned rat. Archer wiped the rain out of his eyes and looked down the street. It was desolate, empty wet pavement reflecting the flickering red neon of a closed liquor store across the avenue. "We need a cab," Camille chattered, her lips turning a faint shade of blue. She reached into her blazer pocket out of habit, then stopped. I don't have cash. I only have black cards, and if I swipe them..." "They track you," Archer finished grimly. He dug into the pocket of his uniform pants. His thick fingers bypassed his keys and pulled out a worn, imitation leather wallet. He flipped it open. Inside was a single, crumpled $20 bill, a debit card with exactly $46 in the checking account, and a faded school picture of Maya. He looked at the 20. It was supposed to buy groceries for the next 3 days. Archer closed the wallet and looked at Camille. She was staring at the $20 bill, too. She understood exactly what it meant. For the first time all night, the reality of her utter poverty hit her. She had billions of dollars in equity, but right now, standing in the freezing rain, Archer Pendleton was the richest man in the alley. She looked up at his face. The cynical, hardened shell she had worn for years fractured. "Mr. Pendleton," she whispered over the sound of the rain, the formal title sounding absurd in the filthy alley. "I have nowhere to go." Archer felt a heavy, sinking weight in his chest. He thought of his cramped apartment in Queens. He thought of Maya sleeping on the worn sofa. Bringing the most hunted CEO in Manhattan into his home was insane. It was dangerous. It was an invitation to let Preston's wrath destroy his family. But he looked at the woman shivering in front of him, standing barefoot in the dirty rain. "You're already in it, Artie," he told himself. "You already swung the mop." Archer sighed, the breath turning to white steam in the cold air. He shoved his wet wallet back into his pocket. "Subway's 3 blocks that way," Archer grunted, pushing himself off the brick wall. "Keep your head down. We're going to Queens." The F train at 3:30 in the morning was a rattling subterranean purgatory. The fluorescent lights flickered with a sickly, yellow arrhythmia, illuminating scratched plastic seats and floors, sticky with spilled soda and worse. Camille sat rigidly near the doors, her knees pressed tightly together. The oversized grey hoodie was heavy and wet, smelling faintly of bleach and Archer's sweat. She was shivering, a deep, skeletal tremor that she couldn't suppress. Every time the train lurched, the steel wheels screeching against the curved tracks, she flinched. Archer sat across from her. He didn't look at her. He sat with his elbows resting heavily on his knees, staring at the scuffed toes of his work boots. The adrenaline crash had hit him hard. His lower back was a tight knot of burning muscle, and a dull, throbbing headache had settled right behind his eyes. He calculated the math of his ruin over and over to the rhythm of the train. Fired, blacklisted, sued, arrested. The outcomes cycled through his head like a Rolodex of disaster. What the hell did I do? He looked up, catching Camille's eye for a fraction of a second before she looked away. She looked terrified. Not the performative boardroom terror she had shown Preston, but a primal, visceral fear. She had been stripped of her armor. 3 more stops, Archer grunted. The words felt like sandpaper in his dry throat. Camille gave a short, sharp nod. She didn't speak. They emerged into the freezing rain in Astoria. The neighborhood was asleep. The only sounds were the heavy hiss of tires from a passing delivery truck and the rhythmic ping of water hitting metal trash cans. Archer walked with a pronounced limp now, the damp cold sinking directly into his joints. Camille followed a step behind, her stockinged feet slapping wetly against the cracked pavement. Archer's building was a 4-story brick walk-up, sandwiched between a closed laundromat and a bodega with a flashing neon open sign. The narrow entryway smelled of stale garlic, damp wool, and old carpet. "4th floor," Archer said quietly, pulling out his keys. "Steps are uneven. Watch your step." By the time they reached the 3rd landing, Camille was gasping. She was a woman who ran on expensive treadmills and took private elevators. The raw, physical exertion of climbing steep, uncarpeted stairs in wet clothes drained the last reserves of her strength. Archer unlocked apartment 4B. He pushed the door open and hit the light switch. The apartment was small, suffocatingly so. A faded brown corduroy sofa dominated the tiny living room, facing a small, blocky television. A cheap veneer dining table with 2 chairs sat near a narrow kitchenette. But it was meticulously clean. There were no dirty dishes in the sink. The worn linoleum floor was swept. "Dad?" The voice was soft, heavy with sleep. Camille froze in the entryway. A teenage girl emerged from the short hallway. She was wearing oversized flannel pajamas, rubbing her eyes behind thick, wire-rimmed glasses. Maya. She looked at Archer, then blinked, her gaze shifting to the soaking wet, barefoot woman standing in their living room. "Maya, honey, what are you doing up?" Archer asked, his rough voice instantly softening. He dropped his keys in a ceramic bowl by the door. "You're late," Maya said, her voice catching on a yawn. "I was worried." Then she looked closer at Camille. "Dad, who is this? Why is she wet?" Archer rubbed his face. This is Ms. Montgomery, my boss." Maya's eyes widened. She had heard the name. Archer had complained about the Iron Queen enough times over cheap dinners. "Your boss, from the tower?" "It's a long story, kiddo," Archer said, shedding his wet uniform jacket and draping it over a dining chair. "She needs a safe place for a few hours. Do you have any dry sweats she can borrow? Everything she's wearing is soaked." Maya didn't ask questions. She didn't press for details. She just nodded, her inherent empathy overriding her confusion. "Yeah, let me look." 10 minutes later, Camille emerged from the tiny, cramped bathroom. She was wearing a pair of faded maroon sweatpants that were too short for her, and a long-sleeved t-shirt bearing the logo of a local high school track team. She had towel-dried her hair, leaving it a tangled, frizzy halo around her pale face. She walked into the kitchenette. Archer was standing by the counter, waiting for a battered electric kettle to boil. Maya had gone back to bed, but the door to her room remained slightly ajar. Camille looked at the refrigerator. It was covered in magnets, holding up a utility bill, stamped with a red past due notice, and a meticulously color-coded medication schedule. On the top shelf inside, clearly visible through the glass door, were 3 small vials of insulin. Camille felt a sudden, sharp physical pain in her chest. It wasn't an impending heart attack. It was shame. She turned to look at Archer. He was staring at the kettle, his broad shoulders slumped, looking older than his 52 years. "Mr. Pendleton," Camille said softly. "Archer," he replied, not looking at her. "Might as well be Archer now. Doubt I'm on the payroll anymore." "Archer," she corrected. She gripped the edge of the cheap Formica counter. "You risked your job tonight. You risked your severance, your pension, for me, and I don't even know why." Archer poured boiling water into 2 chipped ceramic mugs. He dropped a cheap tea bag into each. The water instantly turned a murky, weak brown. "I told you why," Archer said, sliding a mug across the counter toward her. "I didn't like the way he was treating you. But look at this," Camille whispered, gesturing vaguely to the kitchen, the past due bill, the insulin. "You have a daughter. You have responsibilities. Preston will destroy you for this. He has the resources to ensure you never work anywhere near this city again." Archer looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark, bruised flesh. He didn't look heroic. He looked exhausted. "I know," Archer said. The honesty in his voice was brutal. "I know exactly what he can do. But I also know what happens when you let guys like that win just because they're louder and bigger than you. I've spent my whole life keeping my head down, Ms. Montgomery, wiping up their spills, emptying their trash, apologizing when they bump into me. I'm tired. I just got really, really tired." He took a sip of the scalding tea. "So," Archer continued, his voice hardening slightly, "I burned my boats. The question is, what are you going to do about yours?" At 5:30 a.m., the rain finally stopped. The city outside the window was beginning to bleed into a bruised, pale grey. Camille hadn't slept. She sat at the small dining table, nursing her 3rd cup of cheap, bitter tea. Her mind, paralyzed by shock for the last 3 hours, was finally rebooting. The cold, mechanical logic that had built Montgomery Holdings was clawing its way through the panic. Preston's plan. She dissected it. It relied entirely on shock and awe. The fabricated ledger, the sudden board vote, the immediate threat of the SEC. They needed her to sign the proxy transfer in that room, under duress, so they could present a unified front to the market at the opening bell. Because she hadn't signed, there was a fracture. Archer walked out of his bedroom. He had changed into a pair of worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt. He moved stiffly, favoring his right leg. "You look like a woman calculating a murder," Archer noted, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her with a groan. "Not murder," Camille said, her eyes fixed on a scratch in the veneer table. "Survival. If they go to the SEC at 8 a.m. with that fake ledger, the investigation alone triggers a clause in my contract. A morality and fiduciary suspension. I lose control of the company while they investigate. Preston becomes interim CEO. Once he has the keys, he'll bury the real evidence and make the fake ledger look airtight." "So you have to beat them to the cops," Archer said. "With what?" Camille shot back, frustration leaking into her tone. "I have no proof. It's my word against a unanimous board vote. They'll say I'm a disgruntled executive trying to burn the house down on my way out. I need evidence that Gable fabricated the shell company, and I need it in 2 hours." Silence settled heavily over the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed loudly. Archer rubbed his rough jaw, the stubble making a scratching sound in the quiet room. He looked at Camille, then looked toward the hallway where his wet uniform was still crumpled in a plastic bag, waiting for the laundromat. "In the boardroom," Archer said slowly. "I told Gable I pulled unshredded strips of Cayman wire transfers out of his machine." Camille sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair. "I know. It was a brilliant bluff, Archer. It rattled him. But a bluff won't hold up in a federal field office." "It wasn't exactly a bluff," Archer muttered. Camille froze. Her hand stopped moving in her hair. She slowly lowered it to the table. "What?" "I said I wasn't entirely bluffing," Archer repeated, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Gable is an idiot. He overfeeds that shredder all the time. Last Tuesday it jammed hard. I had to pull the blades apart with a multi-tool. There was a thick wad of paper stuck in the teeth. He hadn't even run it through the cross-cut function, just the vertical strips." Camille leaned forward, the cheap chair squeaking loudly beneath her. "Where is the paper, Archer?" "I was supposed to bag it and take it down to the secure incinerator bin in the basement," Archer explained defensively. "But the service elevator was locked out for maintenance. I was tired. My back was killing me. So I just stuffed the wad in my uniform pocket to throw out the next day. But I forgot. It's been in my laundry bag for a week." Camille stood up. "Where is the laundry bag?" Archer pointed to the hallway. Camille moved faster than she had all night. She dropped to her knees on the scuffed linoleum, tearing open the plastic grocery bag holding Archer's dirty work clothes. The smell of stale sweat and ammonia hit her, but she didn't care. She dug through the dark, navy fabric, shoving her hands into the pockets of the stiff, cheap trousers. Her fingers brushed against something stiff and crumpled. She pulled it out. It was a compressed, heavily wrinkled wad of paper strips, bound together by the pressure of the shredder blades. It looked like a crushed paper wasp nest. She carried it back to the dining table like it was made of spun glass. "Maya has a laptop," Archer said, watching her carefully lay the wad on the table. "I'll go get it." For the next hour, the tiny kitchen became a war room. Camille painstakingly peeled the vertical strips of paper apart. They were mangled, some torn completely, but the heavy black laser printer ink was still legible. She lined them up on the table, matching the jagged tiers like the world's most high-stakes jigsaw puzzle. Archer sat beside her, watching the Iron Queen work. Her focus was absolute. The shivering, terrified woman in the alley was gone. In her place was the apex predator of Wall Street, operating on a cheap Formica table in Queens. "There," Camille whispered, her voice tight with triumph. She pointed a trembling finger at a reconstructed line of text. It was a string of routing numbers, followed by a bolded title, Montgomery Holdings, Cayman Acquisition Corp. Beneath it was a signature block, authorized by E. Gable, EVP. "He signed it," Camille breathed, a dark, dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. "The arrogant, stupid bastard signed the authorization for the shell company before he tried to pin it on me. He shredded the original draft because he realized his mistake, but he didn't check the blades." She pulled Maya's battered Dell laptop toward her. The screen was cracked in the bottom left corner, and it whirred loudly as it processed. She opened a browser and pulled up the public directory for the Securities and Exchange Commission's New York regional office. "Who are you calling?" Archer asked. "It's barely 7 in the morning." "I'm not calling a hotline," Camille said, pulling out her matte black smartphone. The signal indicator showed 2 bars. "I'm calling Marcus Vance." Archer raised an eyebrow. "Who's that?" "He's the Deputy Director of Enforcement," Camille said, tapping the screen rapidly. "5 years ago, I humiliated him in a settlement negotiation. He hates me. He hates Preston more. He's been trying to find a crack in my company's armor for half a decade. I'm about to hand him a sledgehammer." She hit dial and pressed the phone to her ear. "Vance," a groggy, irritated voice, barked through the receiver. "It's 7 in the morning. Who is this?" "It's Camille Montgomery," she said smoothly. Her voice was pure ice. "And I have a gift for you. But you need to meet me at the Federal Building in 30 minutes. Bring a subpoena for my Executive Vice President, Elliot Gable." The lobby of the New York Regional SEC office in Lower Manhattan was a cavernous space of polished granite and echoing footsteps. The air was sterile, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale coffee from the security kiosk. It was 7:55 a.m. Preston pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors, flanked by Gable and Davies. They looked immaculate. Preston's charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair brushed back. Gable carried a sleek aluminum briefcase containing the fabricated ledger. They walked with the synchronized, arrogant stride of executioners who had already won. "We bypass the front desk," Preston instructed in a low murmur. "Go straight to enforcement, file the complaint, hand over the ledger, and leak the filing to Bloomberg by 8:15. The stock will freefall, and the board will issue the termination notice to Camille by 9. "What if she's already called her lawyers?" Davies asked nervously. "Let her," Gable sneered. "She doesn't have access to her corporate accounts, and without the board's authorization, her legal team can't file an injunction on behalf of the company. She's completely boxed out." They approached the security checkpoint. "Excuse me," a voice echoed across the granite floor. Preston stopped. Gable and Davies froze. Sitting on a hard wooden bench near the elevators was Camille. She wasn't wearing an Italian suit. She was wearing faded maroon sweatpants and a high school track shirt that was 2 sizes too big. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, damp knot. Standing right behind her, arms crossed over his thick chest, wearing a wrinkled, cheap navy blue uniform, was Archer Pendleton. Preston's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The shock of seeing the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire sitting in a federal lobby looking like a vagrant broke his composure completely. "Camille," Preston hissed, marching toward her, pointing a thick finger. "What kind of pathetic stunt is this? You think playing the victim is going to stop what's in this briefcase? Camille didn't stand up. She looked at Preston with a cold, unblinking stare. I think you should open the briefcase, Preston. Make sure you brought the right paperwork. Gable stepped forward, his slick face twisting into a sneer. You're done, Camille. Security is going to escort you out, and we're going upstairs. You aren't going anywhere, Elliot, a new voice boomed. From the shadow of the elevator bank stepped Marcus Vance. The deputy director of enforcement was a tall, severe man in a cheap, off-the-rack suit. He held a manila folder in his hand. Flanking him were two armed federal agents. Preston's arrogant posture collapsed instantly. He took a half step backward. Director Vance, we are here to file an urgent complaint regarding corporate malfeasance by Ms. Montgomery. Is that right? Vance asked, his voice dripping with dry amusement. He looked down at the folder in his hands. Because 20 minutes ago, Ms. Montgomery provided my office with physical evidence, a shredded draft authorization containing Mr. Gable's signature, proving that the shell company in question was established by you, Elliot. Not her. Gable's aluminum briefcase slipped from his hand. It hit the granite floor with a loud, hollow clang. All the blood drained from his face. He looked at Camille, then his eyes snapped to Archer. The janitor. The bluff. It hadn't been a bluff. That's fabricated, Preston shouted, his voice cracking, the gravel turning into a high-pitched squeak. She's lying. She stole company property. We'll let a federal judge decide that, Vance said, nodding to the agents. They stepped forward, moving fluidly, placing themselves between the doors and the three executives. Elliot Gable, you are being detained for questioning regarding corporate fraud and extortion. Mr. Preston, Ms. Davies, will need your phones and your presence upstairs. Now. Davies immediately began to cry, raising her hands in surrender. Gable looked like he was going to vomit. Preston stood paralyzed. He looked at Camille, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and total disbelief. He had spent millions orchestrating this coup. He had bought lawyers, locked doors, and severed her access to the world. He had lost because a man making $14 an hour didn't empty a trash can properly. As the federal agents escorted the broken executives towards the elevators, Camille finally stood up. She smoothed down the front of the borrowed, faded sweatshirt. She turned to Archer. Archer looked at the empty space where the billionaires had just been standing. His chest was heaving slightly. He felt lightheaded. The suffocating weight of the impending ruin he had carried all night evaporated, leaving him feeling hollow, but light. You did it, Archer said roughly. You beat them. No, Archer, Camille said softly, stepping closer to him. The coldness in her eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a profound, raw gratitude. We beat them. She looked down at her hands, then back up to his tired, lined face. I'm going to take my company back today, Camille said, her voice steady and quiet. And when I do, there are going to be some massive structural changes, starting with the facilities management contract. I'm firing the third-party vendor. Archer blinked, confusion clouding his exhaustion. You're firing my employer? Ms. Montgomery, I kind of need a job. You aren't going to be a janitor, Archer, Camille said. A faint, genuine smile broke across her face. Montgomery Holdings needs a new director of internal ethics and security oversight. Someone who actually sees what happens in the building. Someone who knows when the shredders jam. It comes with a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and a full, premium healthcare package for you and Maya. Archer stared at her. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He thought of the eviction notice in the microwave. He thought of the insulin in the fridge. His eyes suddenly burned, hot and wet. He looked away, rubbing his face aggressively with his calloused hands, trying to hide the sudden, violent emotion that hit him. "Ms. Montgomery," Archer choked out, his voice thick. I don't know anything about being a director." Camille reached out and gently laid her hand on his rough, polyester-clad arm. "You know how to stand up when everyone else sits down, Archer," she said quietly. "I can teach you the rest. Wall Street is a machine designed to crush the little guy. It runs on greed, acoustic glass, and the arrogant assumption that people like Archer will always look the other way. But sometimes, the invisible man refuses to blink." Archer risked his livelihood not to save a billionaire, but because he was finally sick of watching the bullies win. Corporate loyalty is a myth, but raw human decency isn't. If you want more stories about ordinary people standing up to giants and tearing up the script, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that true courage doesn't require a trust fund, and subscribe for more.